Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH FM. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Well, there are these headlines that are creeping up that people have been noticing these days about a strain of an infectious virus, the Hantavirus, and it has people wondering and looking for expert advice about whether we're living a rerun of the early stages of the COVID-19 epidemic that disrupted all of our lives for years. Where the experts are telling us it's not the exact same thing. We don't need to worry so much, but we need some good answers. And we have the pleasure today of getting someone who actually knows about this stuff. Scott Roberts is an infectious disease specialist and associate medical director of infection prevention at Yale School of Medicine. That means he not only studies this stuff, but he's in the hospital with people who have infectious diseases. So Scott Roberts, thank you so much for joining us on Dateline New Haven. And I'm wondering, do you get to go to the grocery store or a family event these days without people descending on you and immediately asking you, should I worry? Is this a pandemic? Wait, hold on one second. Unfortunately, I'm not hearing you, Scott. We were just having a technical difficulty here, and I apologize where I can't hear your if Harry Dross, our station manager.
You could go, Scott.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, Scott.
Hear you.
Okay, sorry about that, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul. I will say I am getting that question from all facets of my life right now. I think you're echoing the anxiety a lot are experiencing right now. And is this a rerun of COVID? You know, how concerned should we be? And hopefully I can provide some reassurance that it is certainly not COVID and spreads very differently. But happy to be here and answer really any questions I can. I should say I have not personally seen a case since we really haven't seen this in Connecticut yet, but we are absolutely aware of this, following it closely and preparing if we do have a case.
And you deal with infectious diseases, which is really the question that all our lives changed with COVID. And we all read endless articles by people who thought very different things about it. We never know which experts to trust. But because I think there's sort of a post-traumatic episode here where people, no matter what comes up, everyone's going to worry. Like we lived through Ebola, we lived through SARS-1, that's kind of stuff we always worried was going to disrupt everything, and it didn't. And is this more like Ebola and SARS-1 where it was a deadly, horrible virus, but it's not going to be a mass event?
Yes, this is much more similar to Ebola than something like COVID. And the main reason is that it just doesn't spread that well. You know, COVID, we think if you pass somebody in the airport, you could get infected. You know, while there can be some offhand events of transmission occurring in those ways, and there's one classic story from before COVID.
Right, we're going to get to that from Egypt, from Argentina. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but it simply doesn't, it's not nearly as contagious as something like COVID. I think we're learning a lot and we're understanding. We don't have all the answers about how it spreads, but based on what we're seeing, it's just not nearly as contagious. And right now, the cases that we're seeing is everybody who was on the cruise ship. Really, nobody has been infected so far who was not on that cruise ship, really highlighting that you probably need some degree of close, prolonged contact for a longer period of time to have a transmission to another person, in contrast to COVID, where it's much more easy to spread.
We're talking to Dr. Scott Roberts, who has hands-on daily work with people who have infectious diseases at our hospitals here, and as well as a researcher at the Yale School of Medicine. We're asking about the Andes strain of hantavirus. So that's what this is. Hantavirus, which is this virus, I understand, you get from like rodent poop and stuff like that. In most cases, it doesn't kill you or anything like that. It doesn't spread. But that in the case of this Andes strain, it does, which was the strain that it was found on this cruise ship where an outbreak occurred recently. 3 people have died. We're quarantining everybody else. What is the deal with this Andes strain of hantavirus? How is this different from what this virus is?
Yeah, this is a very common virus in rodents. And the U.S. has, some 50 to 100 odd cases of this every year. Mostly it's centered in the southwestern United States, so Arizona, New Mexico. And Connecticut actually did have a case back in 2014, but it was not acquired in Connecticut. It was somebody who went to Vermont to a log cabin, swept a bunch of rodent droppings and got infected and came back to Connecticut. So we actually haven't had any locally acquired cases here, but the common scenario we hear about is somebody was cleaning out a crawl space and they weren't wearing a respirator and they got exposed to some rodent secretions or dropping or urine, and they got infected. But all the strains in the US and really everywhere in the world except Argentina, they don't spread person to person. So when somebody comes in, they might be sick, but there's no risk to anybody seeing that patient or coming in contact with that infected individual. The one exception to that rule is this one specific strain of hantavirus called the Andes virus, which you noted, Paul. And so that circulates in rodents in Argentina. And since the mid-90s, when this was discovered, there's been a handful of isolated outbreaks or these clusters where there has been some degree of human-to-human spread. But it's never really gotten that far, or it hasn't ever broken out of Argentina.
Can that change when viruses mutate the way COVID did?
Absolutely. And, one of the outstanding questions here was, has the virus mutated? And now is it easier to spread person to person? And somewhat reassuringly, we already have data showing that the sequence of the virus, looking at basically the code of the virus infrastructure, it's relatively unchanged. So it seems like it has not picked up any new mutations. And this is probably more than anything similar to those prior outbreaks in Argentina, where there's just limited clusters of positivity and infections, which might have been facilitated by a cruise ship. Cruises, they lend themselves to, COVID, norovirus, all sorts of spread. It's just anytime you get a lot of people in a closed space that's cramped, you're going to facilitate the spread of anything.
And then the Andes strains you said is different because that can have limited human-to-human contact spread. Is it also different in its lethality? Because what I've read, and I'm not an expert in this obviously, is that 40% of the people who get this virus die. Is that people who get the Andes strain or any version?
So it's really any type of hantavirus infection could lead to 40% death. And typically what happens is you would start with kind of non-specific flu-like symptoms. And then in some individuals, 40%, there's this second phase of the illness when you have a pulmonary respiratory decompensation, and it leads you to get hospitalized, needing oxygen and going on a ventilator. Which people get that, which don't, is it truly 40%, or is it, there's many more asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic people out there. These are all questions which we need to answer.
And then, so this, just by coincidence, a couple times a year, we have mouse infestation at our house and we clean up the waste. And we were actually talking about this because there's a scientist my daughter's married to who says, watch out for that poop. When we're in our houses, even though we don't have the Argentina strain, you're saying it is as lethal. Is it important people wear a mask when you're cleaning up after mouse droppings in your house?
Any cleanup of any rodent-related debris, I would say, I would take precautions, which would include not just a mask, but gloves. And the mask critically has to be a respirator. So not one of those surgical face masks, but an N95 respirator, for example.
I'm not sure what the difference of that is, Dr. Roberts.
Yeah, the surgical mask is really one that, is probably people are most familiar with. They hand them out when you walk into a clinic or anything. A respirator is a bit different, and what it does is it has a much tighter fit, and it's more sturdy with the mask components. It's called an N95 because it filters 95% of particles that are inhaled. And the goal of respirators, in contrast to face masks, is that it filters aerosols. So some diseases transmit by aerosols, which I think of as like exhaled smoke. They just linger in the air instead of like these clunky droplets that fall to the ground very quickly. So measles, for example, spreads through aerosols. And the thought is that hantavirus, when you're sweeping up rodent droppings, you can aerosolize some of the virus in those droppings and inhale it.
And how likely you were going to get, if people don't wear masks and they've been cleaning up rodent droppings, how likely are you to get sick from that?
Very unlikely. There's actually, as I noted, there's not been a single case of this reported in Connecticut ever. That's been acquired in Connecticut, aside from the one case in 2014. And so ultimately this, and there's 50 cases a year in the US, almost all centered in certain states. So it's quite unlikely. But I think if anybody is unsure, the easy answer would be, wear a respirator when you are cleaning up these, rodent droppings, these crawl spaces where rodents have been. Easier still would be to clean everything without sweeping it or aerosolizing everything, but with a wet paper towel, for example, where you wouldn't run the risk of inhaling any of these particles.
We're talking to Dr. Scott Roberts, who's one of the people around here who actually know what the Hantavirus is all about and how infectious diseases work. So he's a good guy to be talking now because people are wondering about what's the deal with this thing we're reading about with this virus. And he's saying it's definitely not a COVID repeat, but it is something to think about. Dr. Roberts, let me get a little in the weeds here about an incident you mentioned. In 2018, there was a birthday party in Argentina. A person got infected at that birthday party. There were 100 guests. 5 people in the room got sick, and they weren't all people in close contact with them, right? So there are people who are paying a lot of attention to that incident. Like, for instance, there's a guy, Joseph Allen, you probably read in The Atlantic. He's a public health associate professor at Harvard. And he said that all the advice that the officials are giving us is that only close, prolonged contact is the way this thing can spread. He argues that this is repeating a mistake we made at the COVID pandemic start when we got the wrong word out. Remember, we said it was done by surfaces or droplets, and I'm not blaming experts for that because we didn't know. We're trying to figure it out. But he's saying here it was proven in that Argentinian case in 2018 that it's not just close, prolonged contact, that people can get it. Those people that infected others, including their spouses, and he called that a super spreader. Is he right that that's a mistake we're repeating? Is it in fact not close, prolonged contact is the only way it's spread?
Well, he's right in some degree in that that's not where all the transmission occurs. It's likely requires, in most cases, close, prolonged contact. But I would not be surprised if there's certain exceptions to that rule, like this example in 2018, where there was, a quote unquote super spreader, which we're still trying to understand, even for flu and COVID, why some people spread these diseases easier than others. So that example from that party represented a super spreader event. So somebody was, much more contagious than most people think and led to these infections. The only other comment I'll make on that is he may be right also that it is spread through aerosols in the airborne route, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's incredibly contagious. And the example I'll give there is both measles and tuberculosis spread through aerosols in the airborne route. And measles is much more contagious than tuberculosis. And the other example, the other one comment I'll note is that, Argentina has been dealing with this strain since, the mid 90s, if not earlier. And it's not like it's rip roaring through Argentinian society. Right now.
That's a really powerful point. You're saying that it's been over 25 years that this strain has been centered in a place where it has not spread.
Correct. Now, there's certainly clusters and pockets, and I think most of us are predicting something similar here, where there's going to be these localized and isolated clusters and pockets that, provided we can really implement bread and butter public health strategies effectively, such as isolating, quarantining, testing exposed contacts, we should be able to stop this the way we do really every time there's an Ebola outbreak. We
got a message here from someone listening who said the following. The Hantavirus was not created in a lab, so it doesn't have the characteristics that COVID-19 had, which aggressively mutated, unlike most viruses. So is this true that if you create a virus in a lab, it's going to mutate more quickly?
I don't believe it's true that where it was created, the viral mutation rate would change. Some viruses, by their nature, mutate more than others. Measles does not really mutate at all. It seems so far like Hantavirus doesn't mutate, but COVID will pick up a mutation every 2 weeks, which is similar.
Wow. And why is that? Is it because it's created in a lab, or is it something else?
A lot of it has to do with the viral machinery and how many errors it makes when it reproduces and replicates. And flu is another example. Flu mutates so commonly that, we need to update the vaccine every year. And even then, it's not a great match. So, flu, we do not think about as being created in the lab, and that potential is not there. But it still mutates quite frequently. So a lot of it depends on the virus, the type of machinery it has, and how foolproof with the errors it is when it replicates itself from person to person.
And if you don't mind, I just want to talk about one other writer in the New York Times who suggested that everything we're reading is wrong. Because the vast majority of everyone respected who's talking about this is saying exactly what you're saying. The message has been consistent. Don't get this virus. Watch out for rodent poop. It's not COVID. So I don't know how to say their name. Zeynep Tufekci, in the New York Times, who writes a lot about public health, an opinion writer. Had the same point about the Argentina incident. They said that it was a super spreader, and that they interviewed the lead author in the study about that case, Gustavo Palacios, and quoted them saying that it didn't mean that it's only solely physical or bodily contact. That they found that each infected person infected 2.1 others, meaning that it can propel an epidemic. But I think what I'm hearing from you is that it's apples and oranges with different viruses, so that even if our worst scenario were true, that it's more easily spread in less than close contact, that it's still not a fast mutating virus that easily goes from person to person, and that's going to have large numbers of people, even if it, like in Argentina, they've had it for 25 years or more, and you have isolated cases where a bunch of people get infected, but we're not reliving COVID.
That's correct. And that's similar to Ebola. The reproductive numbers around too, so it is contagious. It does spread person to person. But if you appropriately isolate and contain, it's not as contagious as something like COVID, flu, or measles, where you run the risk of this kind of rip-roaring through society and planes and kind of going all over the globe. I think that, it's a non-zero chance, but, it simply just is not nearly to the degree of contagious.
And modern life is dealing with the infinite non-zero chances that a horrible calamity could reach you at any time, right? Like your building could collapse on you, your knee can bend and you fall into a big hole and die. I mean, like, is it like that? Like, I always feel like we can't live our lives. We want to be smart and not take unnecessary risks or prevent against clear dangers, but that you can't live every minute of your life thinking the worst possible small chance thing might happen, or else we can't live, right?
Well, I agree. And this happened in 2018 and nobody cared about it at all. And now it's happening post-COVID.
Because of COVID.
Social media, and so I think the conditions are ripe for this information to spread much more rapidly about a new virus.
So is the super spreader in this case not the Hantavirus ever, but the fears we have because of the understandable trauma from COVID that we're going to look at every report and freak out?
I think that's a great way to put it.
Well, because, I have bad news for your social engagements and going to the store and not being questioned about everything people are scared about, since you're someone who actually deals with infectious viruses. We have 2 monkeypox cases now in Connecticut. Should we freak out about that?
I would not freak out about this.
I don't even know what monkeypox is. Yeah.
Yeah, this is another virus that came from animals and, happened to get in the right niche in a human and spread person to person. But that is even less contagious than hantavirus, or similarly or less, where it requires, very close prolonged contact, most likely skin-to-skin contact with direct infectious lesions. So while we've seen it, we saw a handful of cases in 2022, and based on public health intervention, I think this has really been a success story. We've had 2 cases in the state of Connecticut this year. Compare that to 2022, this is significantly less. And so it really remains in people who have those direct, even skin-to-skin close contact with infected individuals. So that I'm less concerned about.
So those of us who are not experts, when we're looking for advice from you guys, we often bring our own biases to it. So I'm thinking of Martin McCary when COVID started, who was a respected guy. He was in the Fox News and in the Wall Street Journal. Every month he was saying, starting in April 2020, that this is no big deal. We don't need these measures. And he actually said this is going to be over in 3 months. And then he updated to say it's going to be over in 3 more months. And he never said, I was wrong about that. He kept saying everyone's still wrong. And we have this overreaction of people trying to control life when there are small variables and we just have to let things play out. Was there some truth in that we could apply to today?
Yeah, I think the problem is, and I get this too. I'm just seeing everything from different sides, where some people say it's going to be the worst thing ever. Some people say it's no big deal. What I generally try to do, what I advise patients to do is just rely on trusted sources, which historically has been the CDC and the state health department. My opinion is that the CDC, especially with this hantavirus situation, has been a bit behind the ball. And, they didn't even release anything to clinicians on advising about what to do, how to, if we have a case, what do we do, until, a few days ago, weeks into this outbreak. And so my hope is they'll continue to update guidance and give instructions for, what we need to do at the state and the local level about what we should advise people, how we should, approach possible cases in the community. So I think, we hopefully.
I did want to ask you that. We're talking to Dr. Scott Roberts, the expert from Yale on infectious diseases. How much in general does this incident tell us about our public health system nationally and internationally? You said trusted sources. Do we have trusted sources we can still trust? And are we able to handle potential epidemics?
Well, I would say we're less able to handle them now than we were, during or even pre-COVID. Look at just the staffing numbers alone of the CDC and our state health departments. They're going down every year. And so we just have, in a disease like this, in the containment phase, if we appropriately can identify cases, isolate individuals, contact trace exposed contacts, test them, we can stop this. The question is, do we even have enough contact tracers on the phones if this did hit Connecticut to be able to do that? And that's my long-term worry, is that if we keep seeing these resources funneled out of public health, we run the risk of not just this virus, but many viruses in the future.
So is it accurate to say, or am I misquoting you, that you're saying you have concerns about the declining ability of our public health infrastructure to respond to potential outbreaks? And it's not that you're worried, because when you said if we do X, we can contain this hantavirus. I think I'm still hearing that you're not worried that if we don't contain it, it's going to be another COVID, but that you are worried that it symbolizes that maybe one day there will be another.
I'm worried about, Hantavirus 2.0 or whatever the next virus that jumps from animals to humans will be next year. It's just the long-term threats of these are only going to increase. We're an increasingly global society. We can get on a plane and go anywhere today. So you run the risk of creating these pandemic-ready scenarios where, maybe we're not prepared. Specifically Hantavirus right now, I am not concerned. But I would be concerned more long-term if we have, SARS-CoV-3, or whatever the next COVID iteration would be, because I don't think we're nearly as well equipped to handle it.
What are our trusted sources?
So the main ones I use right now is the state public health department. I know many of those individuals and I trust what they are putting out. The CDC continues to be reliable in some forms, such as, hantavirus. I've not seen any untrustworthy information about hantavirus right now, although the information posted there is quite limited right now. And then, I personally rely on a lot of guideline bodies of institutions that I trust. So for vaccines, that's the American Academy of Pediatrics or the Infectious Disease Society of America. These groups of bodies that have sort of risen as the CDC has backtracked on.
State Health Department, you mentioned that. World Health Organization?
Yes. I think the World Health Organization, I continue to rely on those sources, and I do trust those sources. And
if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is still the head of this operation in public health, is that going to help us or hurt us?
I think it will hurt us. And ultimately, it does depend on the circumstance. So, the CDC guidance for many diseases on their website today has not changed in some time, such as malaria. And so that I can trust. But if it's things like the measles vaccine and autism, that information has changed despite really no new data coming out. And so that's a scenario where I don't know if I can trust that. But any break in trust with the CDC resources, I start to wonder myself, can I trust what they say about hepatitis B and, chickenpox and name your disease? And so I think that break in trust will lead to long-lasting consequences.
Scott Roberts, thank you for taking the time out. I know you're a busy guy and you're helping patients day-to-day live, and you're also looking into the research at Yale School of Medicine and Infectious Diseases. Thank you for this message of don't freak out. That's kind of what I got from you. And maybe if you say that,
I agree.
Okay.
I would not freak out in any way. But, if there is a time to freak out, that will be communicated. But I do not think we should with this. And I think this will ultimately stop after, isolated pockets are contained.
All right. And I hope to speak to you again when the next, hopefully not terrible thing happens, so you can reassure us again.
I'll be happy to help.
Thanks, Scott Roberts. Thanks, Harry Drost behind the controls. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It'd Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly with us all day, all night, and all weekend long at WNHH New Haven's home for community radio.